All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you've made your way to this video, then you're about to see an introduction to Cyrano de Bergerac, a play by Edmond Rostand. This video introduction is meant to follow some reflection on your part about the background of ideas circulating before Rostand's time, and in particular, this group of sort of poetic and artistic thinkers who were called the Romantics. Now, I've posted for you a history of ideas video that basically gives you some background about Romantic thinking, where it came about, approximately what times, and how it traveled around different countries and different artistic communities throughout the world. But having established a little bit of those kind of core understandings about what Romantic thinking is, I really want to turn your attention to thinking about what, in your opinion, are your ideas of Romanticism and its importance in culture. So not just that this thing exists, where there's certain priorities held by Romantic thinkers, but how does that actually influence how people write later on? How does it influence how audiences understand stories and what kinds of stories appeal to them? So I'd asked you to kind of think through the question of why you think this idea about these ideas about nature, about heroes, about what's beautiful or what can open up people's minds to a better way of living. How do these Romantic ideas keep alive? How are they circulating across different places? What is it about them that you think lasts? And then the other question I had you reflect on is like, how useful are these ideas? How dangerous are these ideas? They might keep sticking around, but are they actually worthwhile? Is there something good in them or something dangerous in them, or maybe a bit of both? What do you think about the power and the importance of these ideas in culture today? So that was where we're starting from, is a place of recognizing some of these key pillars of Romanticism. That's like the common interest in sort of less complicated way of living, interest in childhood. The Romantics were also interested in strong senses and emotions, and the idea that nature could evoke or create this awe in people. There's quite a bit of celebration of individuals reaching some higher level of understanding and feeling. So that individual focus of Romanticism came up in our pre-reading videos, and the importance of imagination. All of those came up in the surveys you did and the ism thinking that you did through that film. Now we're turning to see how they actually play out in a story and in later culture, centuries after these ideas first started to bubble to the surface. The reason that I think there's a few reasons why I think this is going to be useful for you in reading Cyrano. Cyrano was written in 1890s, so it's quite a bit later than what you learned about Wordsworth and some of these other Romantic painters and poets. But it does involve a romance, a central romance, and a central love triangle that has quite a few features of the Romantic period woven into it. In particular, you're going to see that there is this same tension that came up in the video between an industrial surge in culture. So thinking with like the Industrial Revolution and the technology that came about, how factories and the kinds of practices that were in early factories, which may have included a different vision of childhood and childhood usefulness, how those kinds of technological changes, how the kinds of technological innovations like the creation of a lot of photography or locomotive and steam power and those sorts of functional technologies, how that changed city life, how that changed what audience expected and were interested in seeing. So that when we get to the 1890s, when we get to Rostand's play hitting the stage, you're thinking about the kinds of stories that are being told at the time and why, and maybe start to understand why people didn't think of Rostand as much of a trendsetter. People didn't think of this play that was a throwback to this romantic vision of heroism. People thought it was kind of like outdated a bit. And maybe I'm hoping that through studying Romanticism, you're trying to get a sense and awareness that the tension between Romanticism and realism that was alive in France at the time has some special dynamics to add to our reading of the play. So Cyrano hits the stage specifically in 1897. Just to give you a sense of dates, that's the Wordsworth period of poets was between about like 1770s to 1850s. That was when Wordsworth himself lived. So that similar epoch is happening in French society. It's been like a good 40, 50 years since the sort of tail end of a lot of romantic art, a lot of romantic poetry was happening. And then we get Rostand and Cyrano de Bergerac. And I want to give you a little bit of background information about the play itself and its premiere, because it's tied into this idea of romanticism and realism being in tension, something that I want you to take a look at as we read the play. So a couple of little factoids about the author that I think are kind of worth your time and interested. Rostand himself, he has a really interesting kind of personality filled with dynamics that a lot of the time people take to be oppositional. So he very much valued and loved science, but he was also incredibly artistic. He wanted to have a military career, very regimented, right? Systems and status being very important, chain of commands being fairly rigid, protocols and all that being incredibly important for the safety and the running of an army and the kind of service that's given there. But that's a very different kind of set of guidelines and living principles than perhaps the Romantic poets would have espoused. Well, Rostand has this in both factors in his life. He valued writing enough to become one of the youngest people included in the Académie Française. He wrote so much and prolifically that he was given a huge honor by being allowed to join this academic society very young. Gave his wife a book of poems when they married, and very much tried at the same time to pursue his own interests in science and, as I said, in the arts as well, and in the military. So he has all this sort of circulating. He's also kind of an uber fan of history. And so when it comes to Rostand and the historical Cyrano de Bergerac, there was a historical person that character is based on. He was a bit of Rostand was a bit of a fanboy. He really got into the reading of Cyrano, the real Cyrano's own publications. The historic Cyrano, like Rostand, was interested in how science and art meet, and so there's quite a lot on that historic figures. It was a satirist writing about voyaging to the moon and some accounts of solar dynamics and celestial dynamics. So that's kind of a cool little parallel between this person who fascinated Rostand and Rostand himself. Rostand dies fairly young. He was only 50 when he died. It actually happened to be during a flu pandemic in Paris in 1918. So he dies having established a major career, having created a play too that was never expected to be a success. And I think that's the next bit I wanted to kind of draw your attention to in terms of context lecture here. Rostand's play, remember, 1897. It came about during what's called the long 19th century. It's a period called La Belle Époque in French history between 1871 and 1914. It's seemed to be a time when France's national confidence was kind of shaken up because there was this war, a Franco-Prussian war in the 1870s. So there was a sense of disillusionment that you might have heard about from other great big wars that shake countries. We often hear about World War I being like this, where it sort of shakes up people's consciousness about the impacts of war. Well, the Franco-Prussian War was quite like that in France's own history. So part of what historians now say with some hindsight is that it probably is this sense of disillusionment, the sense and awareness of some of the prejudices that were circulating in newspaper writing and stuff around that war, that it may make sense that there is a desire in France for something different, a desire to get out of the bleak and mucky and realistic writing that was on the stage at the time. That there was maybe this latent desire for something better and or something a little nostalgic. So if you think about like the Back to the Future movies from my childhood, I don't know if you've seen them, but the idea in that movie that there is like a current contemporary or back then 1980s teenager who gets thrown back in time and suddenly has to like figure out the world of the 50s, the what was often kind of stereotypically shown as to be like a golden era. Well, in a weird way, historians write about Cyrano's context in that kind of a nostalgic way, that this play in the 1897 was revisiting a golden age in the 1640s. So Cyrano de Bergerac, our play, it's written in the 1897, but it's actually set in Musketeerland in the 1640 to 1655. So just like Marty McFly in the 80s gets kind of thrown back in time, in a weird way, Rostand is asking his audience to be thrown back to this golden age in France, when at the time, the stage was full of realistic stories of like factory life and street life in Paris, where the Eiffel Tower is in the background. The Eiffel Tower, by the way, this visual symbol of industrial society, it was finished and completed 10 years before Cyrano kind of hit the stage. So it was in that 1887, I think, time frame, 87 to 89. So yeah, so that's in this world of the Eiffel Tower, Rostand is asking his audience to go back to Musketeerland and the golden age of Louis the 13th, the golden age of Cardinal Richelieu from Musketeer books. And it's really interesting when you can look at the historical sources for what Rostand and everybody thought at the time, because although people now say that Rostand's talent is behind a lot of his success, et cetera, at the time there was a lot of doubt, and Rostand even went so far as to apologize in advance to the actors. He literally sent a written apology to the lead actor that said effectively, "I'm so sorry that I've ruined your career because everybody's telling me this play is not going to do well. I'm so sorry." He had that kind of self-doubt about his work. And it was because if you look at the art, if you look at what was on the stage, like take a look at these two paintings of Napoleon. The one on the left is a romantic painting, 1805, okay? The one on the right was when realism had started to really take hold in the arts. So they're both of Napoleon crossing the Alps. But as a visual recap, take a look. What do you think that these photos say about the difference between a realist vision that started to dominate from the 1850s onwards? That right-hand side was dominant. And then the earlier romantic thinking. We're going to look at those next week as a way to kind of recap, but those kind of visually capture the difference in the aesthetic, the difference in the symbolism, and the people who are in focus between romanticism and realism. So the low expectations were there because people thought this was kind of an old way of doing things. So just if you think of like a story from way earlier called Don Quixote by Cervantes. It was a famous Spanish story from the 1605s-ish, I think. In that play, there's this similar feeling about medieval heroism and chivalry compared to modern Spanish life. The story follows a person who whose self-names Don Quixote de la Mancha, the man of La Mancha. It follows him as he goes on a quest to like be a knight in a time when knights are no longer around. In a similar way, people felt like Rostand was taking this old value system and putting it on the stage when nobody was asking for it. And so it's worth you kind of knowing that as a background, and also thinking about the relevance that ended up bubbling out of this play. Cyrano de Bergerac is kind of a cornerstone in French literature. It's seen as a huge foundation of a lot of what follows. And it's also had staying power beyond the night. Like the night it premiered, after Rostand gave his apology for ruining everyone's lives in the theater company. Well, okay, it literally got performed 500 times that year. So the play was so popular with audiences, it got renewed and renewed again and again, and it was staged 500 times. The opening night, very famously, was reported at the time in newspapers for its 40 curtain calls. So just you can imagine what kind of resonance that would have had to have had with people for that to be reported in newspaper after newspaper for this mythology to grow and the audience to grow to have so much demand. It was over a year in production. The reasons might be, I kind of hinted this before, people have said maybe it's because the wars made people ready for a happy, heroic story. It may be something else. And I think as we read the play, I'm going to encourage you to think about why this story has had staying power, not only in France, but in an American context. It's been remade as the film Roxanne. It's been remade just most recently into a modernized version in the half of it on Netflix. It's even been staged with James McAvoy, the Scottish actor, being like with his own accent and his own appearance, not physically altered, playing a slam poet, and Cyrano as this slam poet in a slam poem battle with other people, kind of trying to posture to make a living. So it has had staying power in different cultures, and I think that's worth us thinking through as we examine what it means to translate, as we examine what world literature is all about. And yeah, I'd encourage you as you read and watch the story this week to think about the cultural relevance of Cyrano in Rostand's own time, how you see tensions between realism and romanticism, but also think about its staying power and changing power across different cultures. What is it about the story? What is it about the way the story is delivered and structured that lets it be lasting in its significance for us today? Now you're going to be about to embark on some reading and some viewing of your own. So as you do that, I'd encourage you to remember to think about the craft, the way that this story appears to us, because we could do a cartoon version of Cyrano. You've just had my recap version of Rostand's life. We could do a biographical vision of this story through the eyes of the author, right? And make a film about Rostand writing Cyrano, just like Shakespeare in Love is a play about playmaking, a play about Shakespeare writing Twelfth Night. We could tell this story so many different ways, but we're about to see a stage version, a version where this 1640s world is in front of us. I'd encourage you to think about the way the stage itself is set up. That in theater, it matters where things are placed. We're going to talk about something next day called mise en scène. And review our understanding of that from previous English courses. And if not, then you get to learn that term, mise en scène, all the little details that are put into the scene, into the frame, and into the stage. We're also going to talk about hemistiche, which is a poetic structure that I'm sure is new. And that's about the rhythm and meter, or the heartbeat of Cyrano's duel. So I'm really excited to do that with you next day. For the rest of this class, what I'm going to do is to encourage you to start your viewing experience of Cyrano de Bergerac. Inside of the slides, I've put a framing question for as you read the end of the play, or the end, as you read Act 1. I'd like you to think about what your initial impression of the setting is. And when you're thinking about the setting, please also consider the bigger part of setting, which is the community. It's time and place. It's when and where, yes. So it's going to start inside a theater. It's going to be busy and chaotic. But I want you to also think about the who and the environment and the relationship part of setting, the culture. And in particular, do you notice Act 1? Again, this beginning set in a theater, it's set in 1640s. Do you notice things in Act 1 where you see Rostand putting on his dramatist's cap and criticizing something about French society, something deeper than just the size of Cyrano's nose? Do you see him talking a little bit about French society and things that are weird, or things that are admirable, or things that need to be fixed in the way that the community comes together? That's a big, challenging question, but I know you're up to it. So as you watch Act 1, think about your impressions of the setting. Try to see some of that romanticism, realism stuff going on. And if you can, find some places where you think maybe Rostand's getting into some cultural critique here. Maybe he's trying to talk a little bit about relationships, about status, or about, expected behaviors. And maybe he's doing a little bit of satire or social critique while he's telling us who the characters are. yeah, so I hope you find that interesting, challenging. And as I wrap up here, I just want to point you towards a couple of resources. I have linked in a Quizlet, a little tester to keep track of different characters. So if you kind of forget who, you know, Montfleury is, then you're going to be able to see some of those minor character names. The most crucial, if you get lost, don't panic, breathe deep. You got to know who Cyrano is. He's the title character. You got to know who Christiane is, who's another member of this love triangle, and you've got to know Roxanne. If you can keep those three straight, you're good. If you can keep them in your head, kind of distinct and separated. But there are some minor characters. The Quizlet will help you learn their names. And I've also linked in there the Sparks Notes and Lit Charts versions to give you a hand too. Okay, so enjoy reading. You have about half an hour of reading time with the text and about half an hour of video time programmed in for the rest of class today. Thanks so much for your attention. I hope that this was useful, and we'll see you live next week, but you're welcome to pop into our Thursday class for tutorial help if you'd like. Take care, everybody. Bye.